The sonar speaker hissed like frying bacon and then went dead, and in that hard silence a 19-year-old on phones aboard USS Trepang clenched his jaw, because he thought he had just heard the death of a Japanese submarine. He had grown up on ball fields, not engine rooms, but now he listened for life and death in small changes of pitch, hands cupped over black rubber ear pads, sweat cooling on his neck in the red lights. The old story said Trepang ambushed and sank I-366 inches, 1,945. The shock that grabs you by the collar is this. I-366 did not die in combat that year. She surrendered. After the war, under American control so complete it felt unreal, US ships towed her out and scuttled her off Japan in 1946 during Operation Road's End. The twist is not a loss for our pride, it's fuel. It proves the bigger truth. By the last summer of the war, the United States didn't just win battles, it decided how the enemy's submarines would end. That kind of dominance does not appear from mist. It is made cut from steel, taught in classrooms, drilled in the dark, and paid for with nerve. Palau-class hulls gave crews deep-diving margins and tough frames. Radar masts punched through salt spray and turned weather from cover into a hunting aid. The torpedo data computer, gears, cams, and genius turned human instinct into firing solutions that a steady hand could trust. Early war torpedo failures that broke hearts in 1942 were hunted down and fixed by 1944. By 1945, hot, straight, and normal was not a prayer, it was expectation. Men learned to plot, to trim, to ride out the hammering of depth charges without letting fear steal precision. In American boats, courage looked like competence. On 7 July 1945, seas north of Honshu heaved like iron. Trepang worked in close on a coastal freighter, Kun Maru No. 2, her stack tearing black smoke back into the wind. The captain waited for the angle to settle, nodded once, and spoke so quietly the helmsman had to lean in. Fire 1, fire 2. The boat rocked as the fish left. The timekeeper whispered off the count. A column of steam and rusty water stamped the sea. The hull split, and the freighter folded into herself. A lone Japanese aircraft strafed and dropped a depth charge that thumped the pressure hull like a giant's fist. Coffee cups rattled. No one panicked. Bearings were logged. Trim was checked. The boat slid away, alive and still hunting. Now the thunderclap after the flash. Submarines were only about 1 to 2% of the Navy's people, yet American submarines sank more than half of all Japanese ships lost in the war, millions of tons of tankers, freighters, and warships erased. That is a return on force that still makes planners shake their heads. A small arm strangled an empire's arteries. Oil never reached the home islands, bauxite never met the smelter, rice never moved north, and coal sat in piles while factories went quiet. Merchant skippers sailed in fear and counted the odds instead of the miles. Naval staffs wrote convoy schedules that looked like prayers disguised as tables. Leadership made those numbers breathe. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz did not posture. He paired Bill Halsey's fire with Raymond Spruance's ice and let competence decide the tempo. He trusted professionals, pushed decisions downward, demanded clarity, and punished confusion with instruction, not theatre. The result was a navy that behaved like a single mind at impossible scale. Fast carrier task forces roamed like mobile thunderheads. Submarines sealed the ocean floor with unseen tripwires. Surface screens kept the whole machine safe, refueled, and ready. When something broke, it was fixed. When a tactic failed, it was studied and improved. When a win appeared, it was turned into a method and taught. Industry fed that mind. In Michigan, the Willow Run plant rolled out a B-24 every 63 minutes, an airplane an hour. West Coast yards welded keels into fleets at speeds that would have sounded like bragging in 1941 and felt routine by 1944. Spare parts came in depth, not in hope. Radios, sonar heads, Periscope seals crated, labeled, shipped. Training pipelines widened so a farm kid could become a quartermaster who held depth within a foot while depth charges walked overhead. A nation of hands turned into a nation of craftsmen, and craftsmen win technical wars. The enemy stayed brave. Japanese destroyer captains laid wicked, precise patterns. Sub-crews took risks that earned respect. Some volunteers even climbed into manned torpedoes, proof of belief and desperation in the same breath. But bravery cannot pump oil through a severed artery. By mid-1945, fuel famine ruled. Air crews flew fewer sorties in older planes. Destroyers limped on thin bunkers. Submarines waited in port for orders that never came, because outside those harbours the ocean had turned. American gridded by lifeguard stations, patrolled by subs, and watched by carriers. So the opening shock becomes the thesis. The myth says Trepang killed I-366 inches 1,945. The record says America no longer needed to win that duel. We would tow I-boats to sea and send them down on our schedule. That is what dominance looks like. Control so large even an enemy submarine's last breath occurs under your hand. The kid on phones didn't know all that. He only knew his job, and the people beside him, men who trusted each other, leaders who trusted them, and a country that never stopped sending the parts, the fuel, and the belief that they would get the hard thing done. When he put the phones down, he scrawled neat block letters into the log. Position, weather, contact, action, result. No flourish, just the truth. Because the truth was already the kind that makes you whisper, "Holy hell, we actually did that." Spray iced the lookout's cheeks as Trepang surfaced beside a speck of orange in grey water. A rescue swimmer went over on a line without waiting for orders. The sea bit him like winter. A soaked Navy pilot clambered aboard, boots heavy with ocean, salt drying white on his flight suit. He laughed once, the short laugh of a man whose luck has flipped, and whispered, "You came." The officer of the deck pressed a mug of coffee into his hands. The captain said, "Rig for dive." Hatches clanged. The boat slid down into the quiet place where Americans did the impossible as if it were normal. Lifeguard duty wasn't kindness stapled onto war. It was strategy with a soul. Carriers could push strikes deeper over enemy coasts, because submarines waited on plotted stations like guardian angels, periscopes barely breaking the sea's skin, diesel ready, medkit ready, deck gun manned just in case. Air crews fought harder knowing steel friends prowled the pickup grid. The same boat that saved a man at noon might sink a freighter by dusk. On 7 July 1945, Trepang's torpedoes struck Kun Maru No. 2. The hull rippled. Steam vented. A link in the Japanese coastal chain vanished. Stopwatch, bearing, angle on the bow. Then a strafing run, a single depth charge, the physical sermon of war thumping through frames and muscles. The crew rode it out by the book. The sound of rescue is a small memory kit. Diesel throttled to idle. Hatch dogs spun briskly. A boat hook scraping canvas. A gloved hand snagging a shoulder strap. Medics checking pupils and pulse. Black coffee with 2 spoons of sugar, because sugar jolts a cold brain back to speed. A name inked into the log. Then the sequence every submariner could run in his sleep. Dive the boat. Rig for silent running. Clear the baffles. Ease her to 200 feet. Red bulbs. Men moving by touch in a hallway the width of outstretched arms. Above, a Japanese patrol plane droned and went hunting somewhere else. Numbers give the scene its steel. Dozens upon dozens of airmen lived, because quiet boats risked daylight under patrol planes, dared explosives that could crush a hull like an egg, and still carried on to kill supply ships. Those rescues fed straight back into combat power. A recovered pilot meant a squadron remained at strength tomorrow, a veteran instructor for the next class, and a message to every family. No one is left behind on the water. The belief is a weapon. It holds lines in storms that shatter other fleets. Japanese intelligence officers started predicting submarine positions by where rescued aviators kept reappearing alive. Imagine what that does to morale on both sides. The pilot, wrapped in a blanket, told the exec about the view he had seen minutes before, ditching deck edge to deck edge. American carriers like moving cities, aircraft taxiing nose to tail, ordnance crews loading, catapults hissing, yellow shirt directors chopping the air. No other nation could keep that city at sea for months, fueled, fed, repaired, and coordinated with submarines on lifeguard lines and picket lines and hunt lines. The pilot didn't need to add the second part. The enemy saw it too. Submarines turned coasts into traps. When Japanese planes made it back at all, American boats might already be hauling the men they shot down out of the surf. A chief told the rescued flyer, "We'll get you home, sir," and meant it. Then Trepang went back to work. Tubes topped off, plot erased and redrawn, bearings checked, a merchant's screws ticking faintly through the hull like a long clock. The skipper, a quiet craftsman, waited for the numbers to sing. Match target speed. Open outer doors. Fire 1. Fire 2. The boat heeled a shade as the weapons ran. Seconds stretched. A black column stamped the sea. Another hole cut in the enemy's lifeline. The human element keeps the grandeur honest. A boatswain's mate who could splice a line in the cold. A sonar gang hearing distance turn into danger and then advantage. A helmsman holding depth to the foot. A pharmacist's mate taping a sprained wrist with gentle hands inside a steel tube built for war. None of that shows up in the grand totals, yet all of it makes those totals possible. American excellence wasn't just scale. It was craft ordinary people doing precise things for each other with steady pride. Here is the bridge to the larger truth. One man saved. One ship sunk. The meaning scales out to a theatre of war. The air group keeps its veteran today. The empty bunk fills again tomorrow. The shipment never reaches a hungry port. The convoy that would have formed never does. The submarine slips away to do it again. Compassion and lethality in one patrol is not a contradiction. It is the American way at sea, smart, fast, loyal to its people, ruthless to its enemies, and always, always moving forward. A quartermaster traced grease pencil lines on the attack plot, while the skipper listened to a rhythm that was not music, propeller beats turning into range and course and fate. Here is the problem that should not have an answer. How did a force only 1 or 2% of the Navy strangle an empire's lifelines across an ocean? The numbers seem impossible. The answer is discipline, doctrine, and fixes that stuck. The torpedoes that failed in 1942 ran true in 1944 and 1945. The approach schools took fear apart and rebuilt it as geometry and timing. A tiny arm threw the knockout and never stopped to brag. Submarines accounted for more than half of all Japanese ships lost in the war. Read that twice. It sounds like bravado until you map the wrecks. Ship by ship, convoy by convoy, the tonnage stack climbed past millions and kept rising. It wasn't just steel sunk, it was fuel that never made port, bauxite that never fed a smelter, rice that never moved north. Factories slowed, air groups shrank, battleships rusted at anchor for want of oil and parts. Victory looked like numbers on a board but felt like hunger on the enemy side, a slow ache that strategy could not hide. The boat lived doctrine in 4 beats: find, fix, finish, vanish. Radar and high lookouts did the finding, turning night into a friend. Sonar and the TDC did the fixing, crunching motion into solvable math. Torpedoes did the finishing, hot, straight, and normal, the sweetest 4 words in a control room. Training handled the vanish rig for silent running, keep depth, hold nerves. The human element ran through all of it. A helmsman who could settle a boat at 200 feet without hunting saved lives. A sonar man who heard the difference between a destroyer's churn and a merchant's plod made or broke a shot. A captain, who waited one beat longer for the right angle on the bow, added a page to victory's ledger. The enemy fought back with courage and skill. Japanese destroyers laid vicious patterns with practiced hands. Pilots dove through walls of flak. Submarines prowled and sometimes struck true. But by 1945 they were burning time while America burned oceans. Fast carriers removed airfields without waiting for engineers on land. B-29 seconds flew from runways built in months. And beneath, boats like Trepang kept erasing arteries. Even the myth bent toward reality. I-366 was not lost to Trepang in 1945. She was scuttled in 1946 because American sea control was so complete her final dive happened when we decided, not when she fought. Be on the alert, keep calm, shoot straight. That wartime guidance ran like wire from admirals' desks to conning towers. It turned crews into craftsmen and fear into steps. It turned statistics into pressure the enemy could feel in his bones. When submarines are small in number and giant in effect, enemies begin to think in odds, not plans. Odds break morale. Men start seeing the ocean itself take sides. A sailor in Trepang's maneuvering room, hands black with oil, would never talk about grand strategy. He would talk about amps and valves and gauges that stayed where they should. A radio man would talk about clean reception and clear code. A torpedo man would talk about seals and lanyards and the sweet thump of a tube emptying. Excellence sounds like that up close, unromantic, exact, repeatable. And it looks like this when written down after a hit. Target destroyed, minimal counterattack, depth maintained, crew steady. The poker face of victory is a neat logbook. The question has an answer now. How did 2% strangle an empire? By making competence a culture, by turning repair into ritual, by teaching math until math felt like courage, and by backing all of it with a nation that never stopped sending the parts, the fuel, and the belief that tomorrow's patrol would go out sharper than today's. The quartermaster wiped the greaseboard clean. The skipper breathed once and said, "Very well." The ocean waited, and the boat moved like a thought. Pearl Harbor slept under blackout shades while a single desk lamp lit a chart, and a quiet man with oil-stained fingers traced an arc over the Central Pacific. Chester W. Nimitz did not waste words. He asked questions that cut steel. What can the fleet do tomorrow, and how fast can we learn from yesterday? In that room, war turned from revenge to design. Fast carriers became the hammer, submarines the tourniquet, surface screens the shield, and shore-based air the glue that held the plan together. That design reached every pier, from Eniwetok to Ulithi, until even sailors on midnight lines could feel a beat, the American rhythm that said, "We will be on station, supplied, repaired, and ready when the sun rises." You could hear that rhythm before a single line was cast off. Supply chiefs signed for crates of 5-inch shells and 40-form clips. Radio techs checked radar repeaters and swapped a suspect tube. Torpedomen swabbed tubes and clicked stopwatches, calling hot, straight, and normal with the confidence that only comes when a nation fixes its failures and prints the fix into training. In the conning tower, the exec reviewed doctrine. Find, fix, finish, vanish. Everyone had a piece of the plan and pride in their piece. That is what leadership looks like when it stops being speeches and turns into muscle memory. Nimitz matched strong men like gears. William F. Halsey's speed, Raymond A. Spruance's calm, Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious iron will. Mark Mitcher's cool hand over decks crowded with planes. The best idea won because the culture rewarded results, not volume. That American habit, trust the professional. Measure outcomes moved like current through every wardroom. It meant a skipper of Trepang could take a risk when the numbers said yes, and say no when bravado tried to shout over mathematics. It meant lifeguard lines for downed aviators were drawn first, because rescuing your own multiplies tomorrow's combat power more than any headline. The human element made the design work. A chief quartermaster held depth to the foot with hands that knew the tiny give in a Balau-class hull at 200 feet. A 19-year-old sonar man trained his ears to catch the difference between a destroyer's angry churn and a merchant's tired plod, then taught the next kid in line. A pharmacist's mate set broken fingers during silent running with tape, iodine, and a steady voice. A cook timed coffee to the half-minute so the control room smelled like courage at the moment, a firing solution locked in. None of this made news. All of it made victory. Under this leadership, the Pacific Fleet acted like a single mind at impossible scale. Task Force 58 cleared the sky by morning. Submarines like Trepang closed the underwater doors by afternoon. At dusk, oilers refueled giants at sea, while destroyers guarded the circle. Then the cycle repeated, steady as a drum. West Coast yards fed steel into the loop. Training bases from New London to Pearl pushed skilled people into the gears. When something broke, it was fixed in weeks, not years. When a tactic failed, it was studied, corrected, and taught. The learning curve was not a line, it was a ramp, and America kept climbing. The enemy was brave and skilled. Japanese destroyer skippers could throw a fan of depth charges across water as neatly as an artist flicks paint across canvas. Submariners risked everything on patrols that sometimes hit hard. Aviators pressed dives through storms of flak. But bravery cannot refill a bunker that never received oil. It cannot clone pilots lost to a campaign tempo that never slowed. When American leadership yoked production to doctrine, courage alone no longer balanced the scales. Proof lived in Japanese logs. Convoys delayed, sorties cancelled, fuel rationed, escorts missing. Proof rose from the sea in 1946, when surrendered submarines, including I-series boats, went down only when American sailors ordered the last dive. Trepang's July 1945 patrol shows the design in miniature. She surfaced in daylight to yank a Navy pilot out of hostile water because carrier groups had swept the sky and shore batteries were silent. She slid under and destroyed Kun Maru No. 2 because trained men and good torpedoes make math deadly. She shrugged off a depth charge from a lone aircraft because discipline kept hands steady and systems whole. Then she did it again because fuel, parts, charts, and orders kept arriving on time. One boat expressed the strategy of a continent. Leadership is rarely cinematic. It is a pencil circling an island with a muttered, "We can make that deadline." It is an operations officer tightening a schedule and a maintenance chief refusing to sign off until a gasket seats. It is an admiral who trusts a lieutenant commander on scene more than a perfect diagram in a distant office. The Pacific War rewarded that kind of character, and the country had millions who brought it from farms, shops, classrooms, and garages. The ocean felt it. So did the enemy. Nimitz's staff kept a plain mantra taped to clipboards. Keep the main thing the main thing. Don't chase headlines. Sink ships, save flyers, fuel the carriers, keep moving west. Instruct rather than grandstand. When Trepang logged a rescue and a kill on the same page, no one wrote a speech. They prepared for the next page. Quiet competence became a kind of music the fleet could march to, a drumline you felt through deck plates and through the bones of men who trusted one another. At war's end, American sailors towed Japanese submarines into position for scuttling. A petty officer bent over a line and said to no one in particular, "We ended what we started." Simple words that carried the weight of a system that learned, corrected, and closed the ledger. The myth that Trepang sank I-366 inches, 1,945 is tidy drama. The truth is cleaner and larger. We did not need a duel to prove anything. By 1946, we owned the terms of the last dive. Leadership had turned into geography, and geography obeyed. A welder in Michigan wiped sweat from her brow, while a Balau-class keel sparked to life. Chalk marks becoming seams and strength under her torch. Weeks later, a hull slid into water as a band played. Months later, a crew traced those welds with their hands and called the boat home. This is how industry turns into combat power you can touch. Willow Run rolled out a B-24 every 63 minutes, an airplane an hour, and the tempo infected shipyards from Mare Island to Portsmouth. America didn't just outbuild. It built well, trained hard, and delivered exactly when the fight needed the tool. The pipeline mattered. Steel to yard to sea to victory. Spare parts in depth meant a damaged boat could be patched and turned around while the enemy waited for a shipment that never came. Radar heads shipped by the crate, sonar gear by the pallet, Mark 14 torpedoes replaced by corrected lots, then loaded by men who'd been taught to trust the weapon again. Training bases ran night and day so a farm kid could become a quartermaster who held depth within a foot while depth charges walked above him. A nation of hands became a nation of craftsmen. Craftsmen win technical wars. Details tell the truth. Liberty ships averaged weeks from keel to launch. The record sprinted to days. Dry docks multiplied. Tank farms grew across Pacific atolls like steel forests. Out on the water, 5-inch divided by 38 mounts and 40 m. Bofors spoke in disciplined bursts because ammunition ships kept showing up. Radar sets found targets in rain because depots stocked spare magnetrons and men who knew how to swap them. All of it looked ordinary because it worked. Ordinary, repeated everywhere, becomes overwhelming. GI ingenuity filled the gaps no plan can foresee. If a gauge fogged, a machinist's mate baked it in the galley oven. If a gasket failed, a boot heel did a tour as a seal. If a periscope seal wept, someone found the right lube and the right prayer. The nicknames carried warmth that turned steel into family. Fish for torpedoes, tin cans for destroyers, flat tops for carriers. Language became glue. Morale held because the work felt human. Trepang's story runs straight through the foundry. A woman who never saw the Pacific welded a seam that held at 200 feet, while a lone plane hunted above. A logistics clerk who'd never been to sea stamped the right crate that contained the relay. A radio man swapped at midnight. A machinist in a stateside shop shaved microns off a valve stem. Months later, a chief spun that stem and stopped a leak in silence, and the boat lived. The line from factory to periscope is real, and it is American. The enemy felt the weight of that line. Convoys shrank, sailings shifted to night. Crews prayed for fog. Tankers left once and did not return. Japanese shipyards were brave, their workers skilled, their officers determined, but the inputs starved. Fuel drums sloshed empty. Spare parts grew rare. Every plan began with a wish. Then came the image no one would have believed in 1941. American tow lines snaking out to surrendered submarines in 1946, tugboats hauling them into position for scuttling while U.S. sailors called the countdown. The end of a navy is not an explosion. It is the quiet moment when the other side chooses the time. Generosity rode with the iron. POW camps under American control fed prisoners until their bodies showed it. Guards handed out cigarettes and, when they could, vanilla ice cream that tasted like a ceasefire in a cone. That abundance was not softness. It was superiority expressed with a smile. The same system that turned out B-24 seconds and balaos could also ship Red Cross parcels and antibiotics. It was psychological warfare without a leaflet. This is how a free people live, fight, and treat a beaten foe. You will eat, a sergeant told a thin man, German by his accent, and you will write your mother. Impossible in some parts of the world, routine in ours. What makes Americans proud here isn't swagger, it's the undertaking. Citizens who had never seen the ocean built ships for it. Kids who had never left their county learned to navigate by stars and sound. Leaders who could have hoarded decisions pushed authority downward and trusted competence. The result was a fleet that acted like a mind, the admirals thinking, the shipyards building, the boats striking, the carriers protecting, and the marines and soldiers closing the deal ashore. Statistics that seem unreal today were daily calendar entries then. Production schedules looked like storm forecasts, and the storm moved west. The last image returns to the worker with the torch. Her chalk line became a seam, the seam became a hull, the hull became a boat named by sailors who made it family. That boat crossed an ocean, rescued a flyer, sank a freighter, survived a depth charge, and came home hot with stories and quiet with loss. When she heard the news, the welder smiled and wiped her hands. "Good," she said, and meant all of it, the mercy and the muscle. That is the factory to periscope truth. America built more, fixed faster, trained better, and treated enemies in a way that made friends out of tomorrow. A captain looked out over a grey sea and ordered a daylight surface approach, a move that would have felt like madness in 1942 and felt like confidence in 1945. He did it because the ocean was turning American. Radar watched beyond the horizon. Friendly fighters prowled. Destroyers screened. Submarines hunted with a network behind them, air cover, lifeguard stations, forward bases, and a logistics river that never ran dry. Here is the problem, and it sounds impossible on its face. How do you make hostile water feel like home turf? The answer is a web carriers, subs, patrol planes, and bases like Saipan and Tinian knitted so tightly that the enemy moves only by permission. Lifeguard stations dotted charts like quiet promises. Patrol lines turned coasts into walls. Ulithi and Eniwetok cut transit times and kept pressure on. Everything stacked in the American favor. You can see it in Trepang's July patrol rescue and kill in the same day, because synchronized power lets you do two hard things before sunset. The enemy felt it in the bones. When a navy can save its own while sinking yours, resistance starts to taste like waiting for the inevitable, and waiting is a strategy's funeral. The human details make the web real. A boatswain's mate who could splice a line in cold wind, a sonar gang reading distance and bearing from the music of a propeller, a helmsman holding depth to the foot because a hand learns a particular boat's hum, a rescue swimmer tying a hitch with numb fingers and laughing afterward from simple relief. On the air side, a P-51D escort met a returning B-29 and nursed it toward the field while a submarine took station under the root, ready to pluck any man who fell short. On the seaside, a destroyer squadron tin cans with big courage threw a screen around oilers so the giants could drink. A nation built the web, people tied the knots, technology closed the circle, and training kept it tight. SG and later sets painted targets in rain. The torpedo data, computer turned bearing and speed into solutions with gears and cams you could hear working. The 5-inch divided by 38 mounts spoke a crisp language known across the fleet, and the 40mm Bofors made daylight strafers think twice. On shore, Seabees carved runways out of coral and had B-29 seconds rolling before an enemy staff could redraw maps. A web like that doesn't just trap. It educates your side to believe. Belief is a weapon. Crews step into daylight with steady hands because they know the net is under them. The enemy's view tells the rest. Fuel drums sloshed light. Convoy escorts reported missing. Airfields fell silent on certain days because there was no gas to fly. Submarine captains argued over whether to sail at all. Orders repeated themselves with less urgency and more hope. Even special weapons, human torpedoes pushed by courage and despair, could not solve a logistics puzzle already lost at sea. When a fleet senses it is being shepherded rather than opposed, shock sets in. The map begins to look like someone else's property. Trepang made the web personal. On her station, she lifted one pilot alive, logged his name with careful pen strokes, and rigged for dive. She stalked Kun Maru No. 2 and fired clean, the sea thumping like a drum when steel met steel. She rode out a depth charge from a lone hunter and slipped away at 200 feet, trim tight, faces calm in red light. Then she slid to a new box on the grid because a radio message told her the carrier strikes would push again tomorrow. The grid did not care about luck. It cared about coverage, and America had enough platforms to cover everything that mattered. Question asked, answer delivered. How do you make the ocean American? You mass competence and connect it. You let carriers fly far because submarines wait with blankets and coffee, and you let submarines risk daylight because fighters prowl and destroyers screen. You feed the whole with tankers, tenders, and floating workshops, so the fight never pauses. By late 1945, the sea lanes around Japan felt like a neighbor's fenced yard. People inside could move, but only the way the fence allowed. The bridge back to our opening myth is short and sharp. Stories once swore Trepang ambushed and sank I-366 inches, 1,945. The record says something more impressive. By the time any duel like that might have mattered, we had already won the water. I-boats died on our schedule in 1946 because American sailors towed them to the spot and set the charges. An enemy under tow is the definition of control. The captain on the grey sea, ordering a daylight approach with a steady voice, was not reckless. He was reading the truth of the web and acting like it was home. That is what America built, an ocean that answered to us, and a victory that felt inevitable because it was engineered. The horizon was empty the way a truth can be empty, nothing there because something huge had already happened. A Japanese merchant skipper stood at his bridge windows and counted minutes, not miles, listening for an escort's whistle that would never sound, because the escorts had run low on fuel, because the tankers had been sunk, because the ocean had quietly turned American. Somewhere west of Honshu, the radio man on USS Trepang copied the contact report in a cramped hand and slid it to the captain. Bearings were marked. The boat leaned into the stalk. A single freighter alone at sea told the story of a whole empire's arteries cut. You can feel the silence in your teeth when a convoy system dies. How does a nation that began the war reeling make the enemy's sea lanes vanish? It does it by making loss a method. U.S. submarines, just 1 to 2% of the Navy's manpower, accounted for the majority of Japanese ships lost in the war, millions of tons of tankers, freighters, and warships erased until the map looked like a rumor. The Japanese merchant fleet measured about 6,384,000 tons when the war opened. By the summer of 1945, the working corps had fallen to roughly 1,466,900 tons. The number is a sledgehammer disguised as arithmetic. It means factories stuttered, rice piled up far from cities, coal stayed in the north while need burned in the south, and the engines of war starved with a long, helpless ache. Trepang made that arithmetic personal on 7 July 1945, when her torpedoes tore open the coaster, Kaunmaru No. 2 south of Honshu. The sight was plain and terrible, a white blast of steam, hull plates shivering, a ship folding like wet cardboard. A lone Japanese aircraft came hunting and dropped a depth charge that pounded the pressure hull until coffee rattled in cups. The crew did what American crews did by 1945. They stayed on numbers, checked trim, updated the plot, and moved. Control under pressure is its own kind of mercy. It keeps fear from writing your story. The radio man in Trepang's control room could have told you that rescue and ruin walked side by side in those days. On one page of the log, a downed Navy pilot's name is written in clean block letters, recovered alive from hostile water because a submarine kept its promise. On another page the same day, a target track is plotted and the firing solution called "Saving your own multiplies power. Sinking the enemy subtracts hope. Together they accelerate the end." Even the Japanese naval staff understood that microscopic math. Guess where the next submarine station sits by watching where rescued aviators keep reappearing. Then ask a hard question: how long can we fly when the tankers are gone? The last stretch of 1944 into 1945 looked like a map learning American. Carrier task forces flat tops, and their screens struck deep and refueled at sea like moving cities. B-29 seconds leapt from runways a year earlier nobody would have believed could exist on coral. Underneath, submarines sealed doors the enemy could not see until it was too late. This is what happens when leadership, industry, and training synchronize. A tempo grows that the other side cannot match or interrupt. The escort that never appears in our opening is a symptom. The disease is strategic starvation. Enemy courage did not evaporate. Japanese destroyer captains still threaded fans of depth charges across the sea with real craft. Submariners still sailed into black water, believing they would help their country live another day. But bravery cannot refill a bunker. It cannot invent a convoy out of an empty harbor. It cannot convert a missing tanker into fuel. When numbers move like that, the mind begins to follow. The man on the bridge windows stops thinking in plans and starts thinking in odds, and odds are a slow poison. Trepang's captain, a craftsman of quiet, knew that the smartest course sometimes meant letting a target go if the shot wasn't clean. Waste nothing, risk for reason, not for drama. That ethic, a product of Nimitz's design and the approach school's discipline, made every torpedo count and every patrol a pressure on the enemy's throat. The sonar gang listened to a merchant's heartbeat through the hull and turned sound into seconds. The helmsman held depth within a foot at 200 feet because a hand learns a boat's hum and a boat learns its crew back. Excellence is learned like that. It's not a speech, it's muscle and trust. If you walked the piers at Ulithi in 1945, you saw the physical shape of inevitability. Oilers shoulder to shoulder, tenders with machine shops that could rebuild a ship's soul, stacks of crates labelled for places your tongue had trouble pronouncing. A sailor could stand there and feel the ground swell of a continent behind him. When he went back to sea, he carried that feeling into the red-lit quiet, where the attack plot became a story of a ship that would not arrive where it was needed, and the war moved another inch toward done. The Japanese merchant captain in our first paragraph finally set a course, and hoped. But the ocean had rules now, and they weren't his. When Trepang's periscope feathered the surface a mile off his port bow, the die was mostly cast. Torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal. The 4 words American submariners used like a prayer turned into engineering. The freighter tried to run and could not outrun math. Hours later, a US boat took aboard a handful of survivors, because Americans made room for both mercy and victory in the same day. The radio man folded his message pad and stowed the pencil. Another page in a long ledger had closed. The day the convoys stopped wasn't a single day. It was a season when the escorts didn't show, when pilots measured sorties against fuel that wasn't coming, when shipyards built more piers than the enemy had ships to tie to them. It was the season when the ocean declared sides, and in that season, a quiet boat like Trepang could rescue a flyer, sink a cargo ship, and slide away under a sky that belonged to her friends. That is what dominance looks like without shouting. It looks like the sound of nothing on the horizon, because the other fleet ran out of tomorrow. Dawn came up over a flat Pacific and turned the decks of a task force into a city of motion tractors towing fighters, sailors shouldering bombs, yellow-shirt directors chopping the air, and somewhere under that sky, a submarine like Trepang floated on a lifeguard station, engines ticking over, periscope down, waiting for ripples that meant a man in trouble. A rescued pilot on her deck once said, "You promised you'd come back for me, and you did." And the line deserves to live forever because it explains why American carriers could reach so far. They had friends under the water who brought their boys home. The city at sea and the shadow below it were one organism. The organism breathed fuel and faith and produced shock. Shock landed on the enemy side as a map that grew teeth. A Japanese operations officer could put pins in a chart for Ulithi and Saipan and Tinian and watch patrol lines radiate outward like fences that moved. If a strike went in today, a submarine waited downrange with blankets and coffee. If a convoy dared the coast tonight, a submarine listened for screws and set a trap. The web was air and sea and radio and training and logistics, and because it was American, it kept its promises at scale. That is the part that still makes the mind real, massed competence with a conscience. A pilot named Bill, Lieutenant Yar, United States Naval Reserve hit the water in July 1945 after a dive over Honshu. He got the raft open, fought down panic, and took inventory of what he could control. He saw a thin feather on the sea where no wind made one. And then the head of a man with a knife in his teeth and a line around his chest. "You're real," Bill said. "Most days," the swimmer answered, and the humor did the job medicine can't, because it told a terrified man that he was already back among his own. The boat crew hauled him in, the pharmacist's mate checked pupils and pulse, and the captain said, "Rig for dive," because rescue was the first duty, and staying alive to rescue again was the second. "Hot coffee," someone said, and a hand that had just hauled a stranger from the sea steadied the mug so it wouldn't slosh. Bill looked at the boat, the men, the ritual trim checks and whisper brief commands and tasted the future in the coffee. He asked a question he already knew the answer to. "You boys go back on station, until relieved," the exec said. The words sounded like scripture. Until relieved. It means we hold our square of the ocean so the city can breathe. And because the city breathes, we can do this again tomorrow. Nothing romantic. Everything essential. Numbers turned those human beats into doctrine. One submarine could save a single aviator. A ring of them could stretch safety nets under entire strike packages. The U.S. Navy's fast carriers massed squadrons, refueled at sea, repaired on the run, and launched again, because the system made that tempo normal. Willow Run's rhythm, 1B-24 every 63 minutes, had its echo here. Sorties measured in waves per day, not per week. Submarines already in place before the first bomb left a wing. Destroyers screening oilers all afternoon, so 1,000 tiny routines could add up to an empire-level result. The enemy watched the airfields go quiet for lack of fuel and saw submarines where they least wanted them. The realization comes like cold iron. You are not being opposed. You are being shepherded. Bill wrote home later about the way the submarine smelled like hot oil and coffee, and how the men's voices had a flat calm when depth charges popped miles away. He described the city that pulled him from the sky, decks crowded with aircraft, ordnance crews moving like a ballet, signal flags popping in wind, and he tried to explain why it mattered that a hospital tent on board had clean sheets. Clean sheets on a warship make a different argument than any leaflet. This is how we fight, and this is how we treat our own. And if you end up in our hands, you will be treated as a man and not a number. Japanese aviators were skilled and brave, and their destroyer captains could still plant a precise pattern across a suspected periscope trail. But the web put them always a half-step late. Low fuel scrubs a sortie. A missing escort converts a convoy into a wish. An American submarine picks up a pilot who will fly again tomorrow while Japanese pilots wonder if there will be gas for next week's training. That steady subtraction is a strangling you can hear if you know the sound, the way a harbour's noise thins until gulls have the loudest voice. On the night before Bill transferred off to a tender, Trepang's crew gathered him for a few words no one would remember verbatim, because the sentiment is what mattered. You are one of us? You will fly again? Tell your squadron we are out there. He shook hands with the swimmer who had brought him in and said, "I owe you my life." The swimmer shrugged. "Owe the boat, owe the system." That framework of sentences sums up a civilization's way of war. It is not a lone hero's tale. It is a family doing its jobs so well that the impossible becomes the daily plan. At dawn, the task force city woke up and taxied another cycle into the wind, and under it, the submarine shifted her station 5 miles southeast because someone, somewhere, had done the math. That is the American gift, turning care for individuals into operational advantage, turning industrial rhythms into combat rhythms, making compassion and lethality share a watch bill. Bill watched the deck fade as he went to the tender and wrote the line that should be written on a bulkhead. You promised you'd come for me, and you did. An enemy that reads those words understands that he is not just losing ships. He is losing the future. Night on the bridge of a destroyer felt like standing on the hood of a car at speed, wind in the teeth, spray on the face, the bow throwing white ghosts to either side. While inside the carrier's island, the air officer matched deck cycles to the swell, and under the surface a submarine held 200 feet like a prayer. The question some critics asked then and now is simple. Did we win by aggression or by restraint? The answer in the Pacific is yes. America produced Halsey's speed and Spruance's calm and put both inside Nimitz's design, then synchronized them with industry and training until the theater itself behaved like a patient machine. The machine needed courage and judgment in equal measure. A captain on Trepang knew what that balance sounded like in his own voice. When the numbers sang, he took a daylight surface approach that would have been fatal in 1942 and was solid in 1945 because radar, cap, and doctrine made the risk reasonable. When the geometry wasn't right, he let the shot go without shame because wasted torpedoes are sin when industry and seakeeping have delivered you to the right grid square at the right hour. Be on the alert, keep calm, shoot straight. The triad lived on clipboards, in wardrooms, and in the memory of men working in red light with the deck making small, honest moves under their boots. Leadership at scale means adults in charge who trust other adults. Nimitz trusted Spruance to fight a campaign and Halsey to run a chase, sometimes on the same chart within the same week. Mark Mitcher ran the traffic of the sky like a city planner who believed he would always have enough buses because the factories back home never stopped. Amphibious planners like Turner took beaches by turning logistics into choreography. This is not glamour. It is competence turned into speed. And speed, when you can sustain it, becomes mercy. The faster you crush the engine room of a war, the sooner the widows stop multiplying. The enemy's professionalism did not vanish. Japanese crews threw their destroyers across suspected periscope lines. With the kind of nerve that earns respect from anyone who has ever looked down a periscope lens or through a gun sight. Pilots dove through walls of flak because their orders said go and their culture said try. Submariners loaded chitin for missions that took belief past sane math. If you want to understand why American victory matters, you grant the enemy his skill and will. That way, the outcome says something about systems, not just headlines. The systems diverged. American repairs ran like a reflex. A bent prop gets a new screw from a tender in days. A radar set gets a fresh magnetron from a crate that exists because some logistics officer ordered by the pallet, not the pair. A crew comes off patrol and goes through a turnaround checklist that feels like a ritual at church: cleansing, refitting, teaching, recommitting. The Japanese had the talent to do all those things, but not the fuel, spare parts, and time. When your opponent can fix fast, and you cannot, each exchange tilts the board further. There is a control room moment that says more than 1,000 diagrams. A depth charge walk rattles the boat, a gauge quivers and returns. The captain draws a slow breath. Steady. The word travels like a blessing. It comes from training and temperament, and a nation that taught men the difference between drama and duty. Someone whispers the next bearing. Someone else repeats it. The TDC spins. A firing solution. Lives, that is, Spruance, in a steel tube, calm under hammer blows, willing to attack when the math says attack, able to leave when leaving is the right move. Above, Halsey lives in the way a destroyer screen captain cuts hard to plant himself between an oiler and a threat at 2 a.m, without waiting for a second invitation. Aggression, when tethered to design, turns into protection. All of this rides inside Nimitz's decision to build a fleet that could learn. Torpedoes failed? Fix them and print the fix into curriculum. Tactics lapsed? Critique hard, in private, and improve. Talent showed up? Promote it by performance, not by speech volume. The fleet became an engine that ate mistakes and exhaled lessons. The Japanese map told the truth in 1945. Merchant tonnage down catastrophically, tankers gone, airfields quiet for want of gasoline. Destroyer divisions stretched thin across too many duties, with not enough depth charges to make conviction count. When submarines and carriers work together in a rhythm and the other side runs out of fuel, strategy becomes hope. And hope is what you whisper when the plan has failed. Men on both sides could sense it without any briefing. You feel it in the way a sea lane empties. You feel it in the way a radio net falls quiet. And still, in the middle of that inevitability, Americans kept choosing to be decent. A rescued pilot got coffee that tasted like tomorrow. A soaked enemy sailor pulled from wreckage, got a blanket and, if there was room, a seat under a watchful eye. That combination, hard fists and open hands, did as much to end the war as any speech. It said to allies and enemies both, "We know what we are for. We are for winning and for what comes after." A nation that saves its own with such care fights longer, steadier, and cleaner, and that steadiness can move mountains, or, in this case, command oceans. In a quiet office after VJ Day, a clerk with a pencil and a stack of reports added columns and lifted his eyebrows in disbelief. The numbers on U.S. submarine results are the kind you read twice. Roughly 540,000 tons of Japanese naval vessels and about 4,780,000 tons of merchant shipping were sunk by American submarines, a tally that drives home the point that a small fraction of the Navy severed more than half of the enemy's lifelines. If you want to know what power looks like when it stays humble and gets things done, look at those columns and picture grease pencil plots, periscope feathers, and a helmsman holding depth while depth charges walk overhead. Tiny teams, enormous results. Statistics explain the strategic endgame like a time-lapse. The Japanese merchant fleet began the war around 6.38 million tons. By mid-1945, effective tonnage had collapsed to roughly 1.47 million. That is not an opinion. It is the difference between a nation able to move oil and one condemned to watch ships rust at anchor. Bauxite does not refine itself. Rice does not cross mountains unaided. Aircraft do not fly on memory. When you remove the merchant marine, like a surgeon removing an organ, a society fights without oxygen. That is what the numbers mean. They are not trophies. They are medical charts. Trepang's logbook is small, next to those ledgers, and yet it is the way the ledgers came to be. A pilot recovered in July 1945, name entered neat. Condition good meant one more skilled flyer in the air when the next strike went. Kun Maru no, 2 sunk position fixed. Time logged meant one fewer link in a coastal chain that once fed factories and now fed the sea. Rescue plus ruin equals acceleration. A submarine that can do both in a single patrol has multiplied itself. A fleet that can do that across an ocean has bent time. What makes the numbers honest is that they lived inside people. A sonar man who learned to hear a destroyer's anger versus a freighter's fatigue. A torpedo man who trusted his weapon again after the fixes and checked each seal like his brother's life depended on it, because it did. A pharmacist's mate who could stitch in silence and tape a wrist good enough for a man to do his watch. An officer who said no to a bad shot and yes to a risky rescue because doctrine and character told him which was which. The logbook reads like plain words: contact, solution, fire, recover. But each line cost sweat and sometimes blood. Across the ocean, carriers wrote their own ledger with lines of flight ops that sound impossible today. Launch at dawn, recover at noon, refuel by afternoon, launch again by evening. Destroyers guarded oilers so the giants could drink. Tenders swapped engines and radar heads and even rebuilt gun mounts at anchor. Seabees carved runways out of coral and had B-29 seconds rolling in months. The important part isn't the headline. It's the system that made the headline repeatable. A single miracle impresses. A repeated miracle ends wars. The enemy's ledger read like a slow implosion. Sorties scrubbed for lack of fuel. Convoys delayed until the delay itself became the risk. Tankers missing. Escorts reassigned. Orders revised to cover holes that strategy could not fill. Brave men went to sea anyway, and sometimes died well. But bravery cannot lift columns on a tonnage chart. When Operation Road's End arrived in April 1946 and 24 Japanese submarines, including I-366, went down under American control off the Goto Islands, it wasn't vengeance. It was the book closing. We decided when the last dive happened. Finality, written in steel, and salt water. There is a tendency to treat such numbers as inhuman, to flinch from their scale. Do not. Numbers are how you prove that a strategy worked and that a price paid was not wasted. They are how you tell future sailors what actually moves history. If you want the visceral version, put your hand on a museum periscope and imagine walking it into position while the clock ticks and a destroyer prowls above. If you want the ethical version, remember that every day an enemy convoy did not arrive was a day the war shortened, a day fewer letters went out to mothers, a day closer to the last casualty. A petty officer on Trepang who had never seen a college classroom could explain all this in a sentence. We did our job, and the numbers show it. Those numbers include a rescued aviator who teaches the next batch of kids how to survive egress, a sunk freighter that never brings oil to an airfield, a patrol that returns with dents on the hull and the crew intact. The sum of the small things becomes the big thing. It is the American way at sea. Make precise work, add up to a result so large the enemy stares at it like a cliff face. When the clerk put his pencil down, he looked out a window at a harbour full of ships that would soon go quiet. He did not know that a kid in a middle school 70 years later would learn those numbers and feel a straightening in the spine. He did not know that a historian would call the figure again and say, softly, "Holy hell, we actually did that." He only knew that the columns balanced and the story they told was clean. A small piece of the Navy had broken the enemy's back. The rest of the Navy and the country that built it made sure the world didn't have to climb over the same body again. The sea off the Goto Islands rolled grey and patient on 1 April 1946. And American sailors handled tow lines with the same careful hands they had used on depth charge patterns and fueling hoses. The war was over. A different kind of duty began. Operation Road's End. The deliberate scuttling of 24 Japanese submarines assembled at Sasebo, including I-366. A navy that once hunted these boats now wrapped lines around their cleats and pulled them seaward like pallbearers with steel shoulders. It is a strange feeling to end a fight by choosing where the enemy's machines will die. There was nothing vengeful in the voices on the decks. A petty officer called out lengths and tensions. A boatswain's mate checked a splice and spat into the wind. The tender's winch growled. A launch took off a handful of Japanese crewmen and brought them across in quiet, watchful silence. Someone on the motor launch pointed back just as a charge detonated in I-366's stern compartment at 1350, the first concussion raising her bow like a salute she did not intend. At 1352, a second charge blew. Debris arced, splashed, and floated. A torpedo tube door fell back to the surface 100 yards off and bobbed like a grave marker with no name. The image is hard to hold because it contains both sorrow and satisfaction. Sorrow that any human tool made for killing existed at all. Satisfaction that it would exist no more. Road's End was logistics in reverse. A methodical unmaking of an undersea fleet so it could not poison any future. The same professionalism that fueled at sea and launched strikes on schedule now unspooled cables, timed detonations, and settled a different kind of account. This is what winning looks like when it understands endings. Sure hands, no gloating, and a ledger that says closed. For Americans on deck, the day felt like punctuation at the end of a grueling, necessary sentence. Some had lost friends to torpedoes or depth charges. Some had pulled flyers out of freezing water and seen the line between life and death thin to a thread. Now they watched hulls go down by their own order and felt the keel of history shift under their boots. The phrase "on our schedule" is more than swagger. It is control turned from battle to peace, from attack plots to safe channels. Picking the time matters. It tells the world the fight ended with a mind in charge. The Japanese sailors who came off the scuttled boats held their faces in stone. They were professionals too. Some had believed to the edge of reason, some had simply done their job until the fuel ran out and the orders stopped making sense. A US sailor handed a blanket to a man shivering in a spring wind and said nothing. Decency does not need commentary. The sight travelled fast through a harbour where mixed emotions had lived for months: anger, loss, relief, and now finality. A fleet does not truly die until someone takes responsibility for its last breath. Trepang's name was not on the tow lines that day, but her spirit was woven into the ropes. Boats like hers had stripped confidence from Japanese sea power until it could not be rebuilt. And carriers had hammered airfields until sorties came in twos instead of waves. Numbers tell part of the story: merchant tonnage collapsed, tankers gone, escorts thin, submarines repurposed for hopeless missions. But only the scene at road's end explains how comprehensive the victory became. You do not merely beat an enemy who surrenders his tools into your keeping. You manage his capacity to try again. A chief gunner's mate watched metal sink and thought of a night at 200 feet when the hull flexed like a living thing and the men around him said little because they were busy staying alive. He glanced at the Japanese sailors on the tender's deck and felt the odd, clean mixture of respect and relief. "We're done," someone said behind him. He nodded. "Now we act like it." Acting like it means towing old violence beyond a horizon and letting the sea have it, then docking the ship and going ashore to hold your baby and write a letter to a mother who carried dread for too long. The official notes say the operation's name and the list of hulls, 24 of them, including boats famous and forgotten. The unofficial record lives in memory. The way the line sang under strain, the careful timing of the charges, the brief shock when a fragment slapped water close by, the quiet afterward that sounded like a harbour learning a new season. Men who had spent years thinking about attack speeds and torpedo gyroscope settings went home to think about porches and paychecks and the colour of their wives' hair. The Navy that could do this fight hard, stop clean, is the same Navy that could build a peace. There will always be myths, because myths are tidy. A neat story says Trepang killed I-366 inches 1,945. The true story is larger and steadier. We did not need a duel to prove anything. We built a system that decided when the last dive would happen and then carried it out with skilled hands, no drama, and a measure of respect for men who had been enemies yesterday. The sea closed over the evidence, and gulls went back to shouting over the wake. The sailors coiled lines and stowed tools, and a petty officer laughed at a bad joke, like a man re-entering ordinary life. Endings, done right, feel like beginnings someone finally earned. A Gold Star mother opened a letter with a Navy crest and braced for more pain, only to read words that brought a different kind of tears. "Ma'am, I flew with your son, and because our submarines were on station when my plane went in, I came home. I will spend my life trying to be worth that." The sentence explains everything this book has been building toward why America and why it lasted. A free country fused innovation, scale, and moral purpose into a way of war that could rescue a single pilot before lunch and erase an empire's supply chain by dinner. It is not boasting to say no other nation in 1945 could have done all of that at once. It is simply an inventory of what happened. Start with the hardware, because it mattered. Balao-class boats with deep-diving margins, SG radar that saw through, in rain, TDCs that turned bearings into solutions you could fire on, 5-inch divided by 38 seconds that spoke a precise language across the fleet, 40 bofers that made daylight strafers think twice. Add carriers that were airfields which moved, tended by destroyers whose crews called themselves tin cans with pride, fueled by oilers that met them on blue highways at sea. Add 29 seconds leaping off runways carved from coral by Seabees, who believed a schedule is a promise. Add factories that thought like armies, Willow Run rolling out a B-24 every 63 minutes, shipyards stitching keels into fleets, depots stacking magnetrons and valves by the pallet, so a radar set could be made right in a night watch. Then add training that made all this not luck but habit. Now add the software you cannot weigh, a leadership culture that trusted professionals, Nimitz at the center, Halsey's speed at one hand and Spruance's calm at the other, Mitch's deck ballet, Turner's amphibious engine, and 1,000 lieutenant commanders who made honest calls because they knew they would be judged on results, not noise. Be on the alert. Keep calm. Shoot straight. The triad did not win headlines. It won the ocean. Torpedoes that failed became torpedoes that worked because a nation swallowed its pride, found the error, and printed the fix into schools. Mistakes became lessons. Lessons became doctrine. Doctrine became reflex. The numbers are the drumbeat underneath. Submarines. Roughly 540,000 tons of Japanese naval vessels sunk, and about 4,780,000 tons of merchant shipping erased. Merchant fleet. From roughly 6.38 million tons at the start to about 1.47 million attempting to serve a whole nation by the last summer. These are hard-edged facts, not watercolor. They are what happens when a small arm of a big navy leverages a whole civilization. Nobody else in 1945 had that combination of steel and spirit in such depth. Nobody else could refuel at sea and refight the same day, repair in the forward area, keep lifeguard stations under strike routes, and still have the grace to hand a blanket to an enemy pulled from wreckage. Grace matters in war. POWs under American control put on weight because we fed them. Men who had tried to kill us tasted vanilla ice cream and told themselves a new story about what kind of nation we were. We saved our own because it was efficient and right, and we treated theirs well because it was right and efficient. Morality and utility slept in the same rack. Ask the pilots who went back to fly harder because they believed a submarine with coffee and blankets would be there if they fell. Ask the enemy sailors who went home afterward and told their sons, they fought hard, and they were not cruel. This is the kind of victory that lasts. Trepang's July 1945 page is a microcosm. One recovered pilot, Lieutenant G. Bill Kingston, breathing steam and gratitude. One freighter, Kaun Maru No. 2, split and gone. One depth charge endured without losing the math. It is small against the million-ton totals, and yet it is the way those totals are built. One rescue, one kill, one steady crew after another. Multiply by a fleet, multiply by a nation. You get a canvas so broad even those who lived it had to step back to see its shape. By the time Operation Road's End closed the book on the enemy's submarine arm, the deeper truth had already completed its work. The United States had turned values into logistics, logistics into tempo, tempo into dominance. The last dive for I-366 happened when we said so because that is what control means. The sailors who set the charges did not crow. They coiled lines, lit cigarettes, and thought about going home. They had been part of something huge and human. Building a force that could be kind and lethal on the same day. That could rescue a boy and erase a convoy before sundown. That could decide when a war ended and then choose to build a world where such choices would not be needed again. The Gold Star mother folded the letter and looked out a kitchen window at a world her son would never see grow old. She held pride and grief together like two hands clasped tight. Somewhere a history teacher would one day tell a class the numbers submarines sinking more than half of an enemy's ships, with a sliver of the Navy's people, carriers turning oceans into runways, factories turning minutes into airplanes, and a kid would feel a straightening in the spine. Holy shit, he might whisper, not as profanity but as prayer. It is the only honest response when a free people do hard things well, and then choose mercy with the strength still in their arms.